Hi. You publicly refer to yourself as a modern Orthodox Jew, and I have heard from many people combine that identification with much of your harsh and at times obnoxious rhetoric to refer to you as a Chilul Hashem. I would like to know how you would respond to such an accusation.
I mean, there are plenty of Orthodox Jews who in the past would be called, people who disgrace the name of God for people who are watching on the feed and don't speak Hebrew, people insult me all the time, and that's the way it is. If you don't like it, you're wearing a kippah, so argue. That's all. I mean, what can I do? If people don't like my rhetoric, you're free to criticize it. It's a free country. I mean, I don't know what you want me to say other than that.
It's not a question about facts and who's right and who's wrong. It's a question of public perception. If you are perceived as a religious Jew who is an obnoxious person, then people get the image that God wants people to be obnoxious.
Well, by who? I mean, there are people who disagree with me who consider me obnoxious. There are people who agree, obviously, who think I'm not obnoxious. So all I can do is speak the truth as I see it, and that's all.
Hi. You talk about like the solution to American society, like going back to the ideals of the founders of individualism, the right to be left alone, right, personal responsibility. And I understand that between Republicans and Democrats, there's the idea of efficiency versus equality. But my question is, I kind of feel like it's starting like a monopoly game with different amounts of money. Like coming from an upper white middle class family, like most of the kids in YU can say, it's great, individual rights, I don't want to pay high taxes, I don't want these responsibilities, societal responsibilities. At the same time, there is a cycle of poverty that exists, and I think if a lot of people were put in the position of somebody who wasn't born with such privilege, they wouldn't have
great question. So there is on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, it was their book review section this weekend. There's a new book that's out, and this book basically makes the argument that the worst thing that you can do in politics is empathy. Not compassion, empathy. There's a difference. The way they define empathy is you putting yourself in somebody else's shoes or looking very closely at somebody else's case and trying to feel like they feel, because this skews your perspective on what good policy looks like. Compassion is you saying, I feel bad for that person, and then looking at the policy that's best calibrated toward helping that person. Empathy is putting yourself in that person's shoes, and we never see ourselves clearly. So if you're making policy for yourself, even if you're putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, you end up in trouble. So when it comes to the unequal distribution of resources at birth, right, this is true in a wide variety of areas. The problem that you see for folks who believe in big government and the left is what Thomas Sowell called the quest for cosmic justice. The idea that government can fix problems that are not really the fault of government or individuals. It's not your fault where you're born. You were born. You didn't have a choice in it, right? The Talmud's pretty clear about this, right? So the fact is that people are born in different statuses, right? Some of us are bulky and good-looking. Some of us are skinny, right? Some of us are right? Some of us are tall. Some of us are short. Some of us are smart. Some of us are members of the Obama administration, right? But that unequal distribution of resources is not something that can be cured by a government that is not omnipotent and not all-seeing, right? The fact is that you have to tell me who has a better shot at success in America, a person who's born into great wealth but stupid, or a person who's really smart and hardworking. Hardworking, by the way, is something people are born with to a certain extent, and born middle class. Right, and you can't. It doesn't break down clearly on the basis of race. It doesn't break down clearly on the basis of income. There's still tremendous income mobility in the United States. The fact is that when people talk about the top 1%, for example, that's a different set of people every year. I've been inside the 1%. I've been outside the 1%. Right. The fact is that hopefully a lot of people in this room at some point will be inside the 1%. As you get older, the chances of you being in the top 1% significantly increase. The idea that government can come in and right all wrongs is just it's a fallacy, and what you end up doing is invading individuals' rights. So when I say equality, what I'm talking about is equality of rights. The government can't guarantee equality of opportunity because, again, the government isn't God, and God didn't make the world that way. But, right, the poor will always be with you. But the idea that the idea that government's job is to guarantee that nobody infringes on your rights and that we all have equal rights, that's something that the government is instituted to do. It's not instituted to do justice by taking my money and giving it to you, for example, or if you and your friends vote to take my money and give it to you, that's still theft.
Hi, my question is about, at the end of the speech you talked about how you preach decency and you just encourage everyone to be a mensch. but in the middle of your speech, and you can call me out on being a liberal snowflake or whatever
it's fine.
about my feelings, but then you, in the middle of your speech, I think this was hate speech, you made fun of transgenders. Well,
I made fun of one person who grabbed me by the back of the neck and threatened me with violence, to be fair.
I mean, yes, but also Caitlyn Jenner, and you seem to be making, I don't want, you were clearly making jokes at the expense of transgender people. So my question is, where do you draw the line between being a mensch and clearly offending people? Like, where do you draw the line?
Okay, so for me, so for me, if I coldly and clearly state a fact and you're offended by the fact, that's not me being responsible for offending you, that's me saying a fact and you being offended. As far as me making jokes about Zoe Tur, my general rule is that if somebody grabs me by the back of the neck and threatens me with violence on national television, I have the right to make fun of them. That's just as when I was at University of Wisconsin, if people are going to chant at me and yell at me, then I'm not going to treat them with courtesy because they are not deserving of courtesy. Courtesy is something that you earn by being courteous.
Okay, fine. I understand that, but it just seems a little bit hypocritical to brag about the fact that you openly humiliated someone on national television while also telling people to be mensches. I just think that's a little.
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. My belief is in mutually assured destruction. So if you're going to, if you attempt to again do me physical harm on national TV, then I'm not going to treat you with a level of respect that you have not earned. I mean, I'm treating you with respect, and we disagree, right? Because you're courteous. So thank you for that.
Thanks for coming. I'm a leftist.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it. It's easier to come when you agree with me, so I like that you came and you didn't. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and the reason I'm here is because I have friends who are Republican and hold you in very high esteem. And we have our conversations, and I felt like to get a better sense of where we're at. And I think that our discourse is very toxic right now, and I think we need more conversations like this. My question is about the current opioid crisis that's currently causing a lot of devastation in this country. In response to the crisis, which has gotten a lot of attention in the past year, and in the Republican primaries, for example, we're starting to see a rollback of mandatory minimum sentencing laws, and we're starting to see an unprecedented investment into drug treatment and rehabilitation centers around the country. And my question to you is, why do you think that our nation's response to this particular crisis is so dramatically different from our nation's response to the crack epidemic of the 80s?
So the heroin crisis. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. It's a lot going. So so the truth is that the crack epidemic of the 1980s, the response was largely built into the legislation at the time. That the crackdown was built into legislation by a lot of actually black Democrat members of Congress who wanted harsher sentencing for cracks. They thought it was ravaging their communities. In the time since then, all drug cases have now been looked at more liberally. So if you were convicted in 1985, chances are you were going to get a much longer sentence than you would today under the exact same laws, although there's still mandatory minimums. By the way, the sentence people think it's a race thing because heroin is a white people drug, basically, in Vermont, and crack cocaine is a black people drug, supposedly. And the criminal statistics bear this out. But if you want to take like an actual equivalent that's a little bit more, that's a little bit less apples and oranges, the best equivalent is crystal meth versus crack. So crystal meth sentences, because they're about equally addictive and they can be distributed nearly as easily. So the fact is the crystal meth sentences, for example, for an ounce of crystal meth, are exactly the same, federally anyway, as the sentences for an ounce of crack cocaine. Those are exactly equal. As far as why the country seems to have more sympathy for white drug users in Vermont, as you say, at least in the Republican Party, all I can say is that they should have, if they do, that's wrong, and they should have sympathy for all drug users. I'm not going to attribute motives to people unless you cite me a specific person, and then I can actually look into their motives, but I'm not going to attribute a racist motive to somebody without evidence of actual racism. But what I would say is that perspectives on drugs have changed over time. Crack cocaine is not nearly the threat that it was back in the 1980s, and heroin is a much greater threat than it was back in the 1980s. If heroin had been the same threat as crack cocaine back in the 1980s, maybe it's not treated differently. Sure.
First of all, I think the question that we're dealing with here is a question of how to solve a problem. Okay, it's a very practical issue. You have people like Jeb Bush and Kasich making the argument that we shouldn't see addiction as a moral failing, but rather we need to see it as a mental illness. And the question is, when you have addiction in a community, what are the correct approaches? You have Ted Cruz gave a very moving speech during the Republican primaries about losing his sister to addiction. Jeb Bush has a daughter who's been in and out of rehab and has been arrested for possession. I recently lost a neighbor of mine in West Hempstead to a heroin overdose, okay? And so do you understand then why, when there's this linking of arms and there's this question that we ask ourselves, like what kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of suffering do we want to allow our people to endure? And that wasn't offered to, when it affected sort of like this faceless other of people. Do you see why there might be some sort of resentment towards that?
I would see certainly I can see why there would be resentment. I think that the resentment would be more justified if the people pressuring for harsher crack sentences at the time that harsher crack sentences were passed were a bunch of white people who were just looking to throw black people in prison. Right? That's which seems to be the premise of your question. By the way, the idea that drug users are the ones who are largely in prisons is not true. The fact is that most of the people who are in prison for drug possession pled down from drug distribution. So that's kind of a different story. I think that what you're seeing is actually now a pretty stark dichotomy between how politicians are treating drug use and how politicians are treating drug distribution, which I think is fair. I think that if you're distributing drugs, that has externalities. If you're using drugs, that seems to be whether you call it a personal moral failing or an addiction problem. That has to be solved differently than somebody who's actually going outside a playground and distributing drugs to 12-year-olds.
Hi, Ben. I'm also a huge fan, so I very much appreciate you coming out. So I watch a lot of your podcasts and your previous speeches, and even from your speech now, you seem very optimistic about the future of conservatism in the United States. But if you just look at how things have been going, I mean, the last two times that Republicans won their first term, they didn't win the popular vote. And Trump didn't even win based on conservative values. He won because of nationalistic and anti-establishment, and basically by just not being Hillary. And I just don't see how there's a future, whether it's on larger issues like socialism, which the entire millennial generation seems to be mainstreaming, or on specific issues like BDS, like the numbers just don't seem to be there or getting there.
Well, I think that the biggest mistake that conservatives make, and this is why I think conservatives lose elections, it's actually something I think Trump is good at, but in a really not great way, is Trump speaks the language of political morality. So with Trump, there's always good guys and bad guys. That's actually how people see the world. Paul Ryan is a worse politician than Donald Trump. He actually is, because Paul Ryan is somebody who talks about efficiency and whether this program is going to work or not, and whether this program has the best ROI, return on investment. That stuff doesn't convince anybody to vote. People vote because they feel a certain sense of unearned moral superiority in voting for the person for whom they vote. Right? They feel like a better person for having voted a certain way. So a lot of people felt better this election cycle for not having voted for that crook Hillary. And on the other side, you have a lot of people who felt a lot better for not having voted for that putz Trump, right? I mean, that's the way that people felt. And what conservatives have failed to do is speak the language of morality. So when I'm talking about socialism, I'm not talking about why socialism fails, okay? Socialism it does fail, but that's not as important to people's perception of politics is the fact that socialism is at root unfair. The stupidest thing that Republicans and conservatives have done for years is say socialism, wonderful idea, terrible idea in practice, but wonderful idea. No, it's a crappy idea and it's bad in practice. Right? And the reason it's bad is because if you and your friends decide to steal my wallet, that doesn't make it better. It doesn't make it fairer. You just stole my wallet. Right? So it's imperative that, and if you start speaking in these sorts of terms, you actually find that there's a broader audience for your message than just if you're arguing facts and figures, because most people don't operate in that realm. It's why Mitt Romney lost, but Donald Trump won more votes than Romney, because people would rather imbibe even wrong grade school morality, which is what Trump was preaching, than 57-point tax plans. And so I do think, look, if I didn't think there was hope for the politics of the country, I wouldn't be out here preaching all the time and spend my life trying to convince people of this. I will admit, I think that we're moving into a dark period in American politics where tribalism is taking over, and a lot of people are seeing government as a club that they can wield against their enemies. That scares me. But the solution to that is to speak in moral terms, not necessarily in terms of efficiency.
We'll be right back.